"Sir, that seat is reserved for people who actually belong here." The words sliced cleanly through the low hum of conversation, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables. The grand ballroom of the National Veterans Leadership Gala shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their warm light reflecting off polished brass, dark dress uniforms, and rows of carefully arranged chairs facing the stage. At the center of the front row sat a single reserved seat marked with a small white name card. A moment earlier, 84-year-old Thomas Whitaker had been sitting there quietly. Now he stood beside it. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply held a folded invitation in one hand and looked at the young major standing before him. Major Mark Ellison was 32, confident, ambitious, and painfully aware of every important guest entering the ballroom. In his mind, the old man standing in front of him did not fit the picture. Thomas wore a simple charcoal suit that had clearly seen many years of careful use. The sleeves were slightly worn at the cuffs. His black shoes were polished, but old. No medals decorated his lapel. No ribbons announced a military career. To most people in the room, he looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong event. "I'm going to need you to move, sir," Ellison said, his voice polite enough to avoid attention, but sharp enough to make his point. "Those seats are for honored guests." Thomas glanced toward the stage. American flags stood motionless beneath the lights. Military band members quietly adjusted music stands near the curtain. Across the ballroom, waiters moved between tables carrying trays of iced tea and coffee. Everything about the evening felt orderly, formal, important. Thomas nodded once. "I understand." His voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly deep. The major frowned. Most people would have argued by now. Most people would have demanded an explanation. This old man simply stepped aside. That somehow irritated him even more. "Good," Ellison replied. "There are open seats in the back." Before Thomas could respond, a young corporate sponsor in an expensive navy suit approached. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just a seating issue," Ellison answered. This front row spot was mistakenly occupied. The younger man laughed lightly. "Happens every year." Without hesitation, he lowered himself into the chair Thomas had just vacated. Several nearby guests smiled politely and returned to their conversations. The moment passed almost instantly for everyone except Thomas. He remained standing beside the aisle, still holding the folded invitation. His expression never changed. The ballroom lights reflected softly in his pale blue eyes as he watched the stage in silence. Not the chair, not the people who had taken it. The stage. A few rows behind him, Captain Emily Parker noticed the exchange. Something about it felt wrong. She couldn't explain why. The old man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't looked angry. Yet there was a quiet dignity about him that made the scene feel uncomfortable, as though everyone had missed something important. Thomas slowly unfolded the invitation in his hand. The paper had been opened and closed so many times that faint creases crossed its surface like tiny roads. He glanced at a single line near the bottom and then folded it again. A distant smile almost appeared before fading away. He slipped the invitation back into his pocket and rested a hand against his jacket. Nearby, laughter drifted through the room. Glasses clinked. Conversations continued. Nobody noticed the old challenge coin hidden inside that jacket pocket. Nobody noticed the worn edges or the faint scratches across its surface. And nobody knew that before the evening was over, one simple sentence would bring the entire ballroom to its feet. Captain Emily Parker could not explain the feeling. She had attended enough ceremonies to recognize awkward moments, seating mistakes, and misunderstandings. They happened at every large military event. Yet as she watched the old man move quietly toward the side of the ballroom, something continued to bother her. The National Veterans Leadership Gala was designed to celebrate service, sacrifice, and history. The banners hanging from the walls displayed photographs from decades of American military heritage. Uniformed service members, mingled with retired officers, civic leaders, and families. Stories were supposed to be remembered here, not forgotten. Thomas Whitaker stopped near a row of decorative columns overlooking the ballroom floor. From there, he had a clear view of the stage. He seemed perfectly content standing alone. He folded his hands in front of him and listened as the military band began tuning their instruments. The soft notes drifted through the room like distant echoes. Around him, guests continued arriving. Some wore ribbons and medals. Others carried the polished confidence that came with titles and influence. Thomas carried neither. He simply watched. Major Mark Ellison, meanwhile, felt satisfied that he had handled the situation. The event schedule was already running behind. Security details were changing by the minute. Several senior officials were expected to arrive within the hour. The last thing he needed was confusion in the front row. He glanced toward the occupied seat and nodded approvingly. Problem solved. At least that was what he believed. Across the ballroom, a large digital screen displayed photographs of decorated veterans. Faces from Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan appeared one after another beneath soft patriotic music. Many guests paused to watch. Thomas did too. For a moment his expression changed. The faintest shadow crossed his features. Not sadness, not regret. Memory. Long years compressed into a single glance. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket and rested on the old challenge coin. The metal felt cool against his fingertips. Worn smooth by decades of handling, it carried scratches that no amount of polishing could remove. Thomas closed his hand around it and looked back toward the stage. Captain Parker noticed the motion. The coin itself remained hidden, but she saw the way he held it. Carefully, respectfully, as though it mattered far more than anyone around him could understand. Nearby, two younger officers were discussing promotions. A corporate executive was explaining a new defense contract. Laughter rose from one of the sponsor tables. The room buzzed with ambition and accomplishment. Yet the old man standing alone seemed disconnected from all of it. Not excluded, not unwelcome, simply untouched by the need to impress anyone. The distinction intrigued her. Then she noticed something else. One of the event coordinators hurried across the ballroom, carrying a clipboard. The woman stopped near the front row, glanced at the occupied reserved seat, and immediately looked confused. She checked her paperwork, looked at the chair again, then checked the paperwork a second time. Her expression tightened. Before she could say anything, another coordinator approached and pulled her away toward the stage entrance. Whatever question had formed disappeared beneath the growing urgency of the evening. Captain Parker watched the exchange carefully. A small knot of curiosity tightened in her chest. She turned her gaze back toward Thomas Whitaker. The old veteran remained exactly where he was, calm and silent beneath the chandelier light. The ballroom saw an elderly man waiting for a ceremony to begin. Emily had the growing suspicion she was looking at someone the room had failed to recognize. The first announcement echoed through the ballroom a few minutes later. Guests were asked to find their seats as the evening program prepared to begin. The low murmur of conversation gradually softened. Chairs slid across carpet. Uniforms straightened. Glasses were set aside. Attention drifted toward the brightly lit stage at the front of the hall. Thomas Whitaker remained near the column where he had been standing. He made no effort to reclaim the seat that had been taken from him. He simply watched the room settle into place. Major Mark Ellison noticed him again and felt a flash of irritation. The old man was still there, still standing, still somehow drawing attention without saying a word. Ellison walked across the aisle with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Several guests moved aside automatically as he approached. "Sir," he said, stopping in front of Thomas. "I thought we already handled this." Thomas looked at him calmly. "We did." The answer was so simple that it caught Ellison off guard. "Then why are you still standing here?" Thomas glanced toward the stage. "I came to attend the ceremony." Ellison folded his arms. From the side of the room, a few nearby guests overheard the exchange and turned their heads. Thomas nodded once. "That will be fine." The major felt the conversation slipping away from his control. The old man refused to become defensive, refused to argue, refused to justify himself. Instead of making him look foolish, it somehow made everyone else uncomfortable. The corporate sponsor sitting in the front row seat laughed quietly and leaned back. Maybe he likes the view from over there better. A few people chuckled. The sound was not cruel, but it carried enough dismissiveness to sting. Thomas did not react. He had heard worse things in 84 years. Captain Emily Parker watched from 3 rows back. Every instinct told her the situation should have ended already. Yet the tension remained. It hovered in the air like an approaching storm no one else could feel. Ellison reached for professionalism again. "Sir, if you would like, I can have someone escort you to a seat in the rear section." Thomas slowly removed the folded invitation from his jacket pocket. The paper looked old against his weathered hands. He unfolded it carefully and offered it to the major. "General Harlan asked me to be here." Ellison took the invitation and scanned it. His expression immediately hardened. The name printed near the bottom read Thomas Whitaker. Nothing else stood out. No title, no rank, no special designation. To him, it looked like a standard invitation. General Harlan sends out hundreds of invitations, Ellison replied. That does not mean you belong in the front row. Thomas studied him for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only patience. The general told me that seat would be waiting. The sponsor sitting in the reserved chair laughed again. Did he call you personally too? More smiles appeared around the table. Ellison handed the invitation back. With all due respect, sir, General Harlan has far more important things to worry about than reserved seating arrangements. The old veteran carefully folded the invitation along the same worn creases and returned it to his pocket. Perhaps the answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it somehow made Ellison feel as though he had lost something he could not identify. As the major turned away, a sudden movement caught everyone's attention. Something small had slipped from Thomas's jacket pocket and landed softly on the carpet near his feet. A worn metal challenge coin rolled once beneath the ballroom lights before coming to rest. The sponsor nearest the aisle bent down, picked it up between two fingers, and frowned. What is this supposed to be? He asked. For the first time all evening, Thomas's eyes shifted away from the stage and locked onto the object in the man's hand. The sponsor turned the coin over in his hand, holding it beneath the chandelier light as though inspecting a trinket from a flea market. It was roughly 2 inches across, its edges worn smooth by decades of use. One side carried a faded emblem nearly erased by time. The other bore a set of shallow scratches that looked random to everyone except the man standing a few feet away. Looks pretty beat up, the sponsor said. You could probably buy a nicer one in the gift shop. A few people nearby laughed softly. Major Mark Ellison glanced at the coin and shrugged. To him, it looked exactly like what the sponsor described. Old, tarnished, unremarkable. Thomas Whitaker remained still. His gaze never left the coin. I would appreciate it if you handed it back, he said quietly. The sponsor smirked. What is it? Thomas did not answer immediately. Around them, guests continued settling into their seats as the opening ceremony drew closer. The military band had stopped tuning. Event staff moved quickly near the stage curtains. The atmosphere of anticipation grew stronger with every passing minute. Yet a small circle of attention now surrounded the old veteran and the object in the younger man's hand. Just a coin? The sponsor pressed. Or some secret military treasure? More amusement flickered across nearby faces. Thomas's expression never changed. It is important to me. The answer only encouraged the sponsor. Important because of what? He flipped the coin into the air once and caught it. The motion was casual, careless. Several people chuckled. Again, Captain Emily Parker felt her stomach tighten. She did not know why. She could not explain it. But she suddenly wished the man would stop. Thomas watched the coin rise and fall through the light. For a brief moment, the ballroom seemed very far away. The music, the conversations, the polished tables, the elegant uniforms all faded into the background. His eyes followed the worn metal, as if it carried something far heavier than its weight. Please, he said, give it back. The sponsor finally held it out. But before Thomas could take it, the man glanced at the scratched side and frowned. What does this mean? The room seemed to narrow. Thomas looked at the marks. 3 simple lines. A number. A tiny hand-engraved symbol almost invisible beneath decades of wear. The sight of it stirred something old. Something buried. The bright ballroom lights dissolved into memory. He could almost feel cold rain against his face. Hear the distant rumble of helicopter blades cutting through low clouds. Smell wet earth and diesel fuel carried on the wind. He saw a steep hillside disappearing into darkness. Young faces illuminated by red instrument lights. Men exhausted beyond words yet refusing to quit. He remembered standing beside another young soldier who had looked no older than 22. A lieutenant then. Determined. Stubborn. Refusing special treatment. The memory flickered like a photograph caught in sunlight. Then it vanished. The ballroom returned. The chandeliers. The tables. The voices. The sponsor was still staring at the coin. Well, he asked. Thomas slowly reached out and took it back. His fingers closed around the worn metal. It reminds me of some people, he said. The answer sounded simple. Yet something in the way he said it silenced the laughter. For half a second, nobody spoke. Then the moment broke. The sponsor shrugged and returned to his seat. Major Ellison checked his watch. Conversations resumed. The tension seemed to dissolve. But Captain Emily Parker had seen the engraving before the coin disappeared into Thomas's hand. Only for an instant. Only a glimpse. Yet the symbol lodged itself in her memory. A strange mark. A hill. And beneath it, the number 41. Something about it felt familiar. Deeply familiar. And for the first time that evening, she found herself wondering not who Thomas Whitaker was, but what story the entire room had failed to notice. Captain Emily Parker spent the next several minutes trying to focus on the ceremony preparations, but her attention kept drifting back to the old veteran standing alone near the column. The ballroom lights reflected off polished nameplates and silver centerpieces. Event staff moved with increasing urgency. The opening remarks were less than 15 minutes away. Yet one small detail refused to leave her mind. Hill 41. She had seen those words before. Not recently. Not in any official briefing. Somewhere much older. Somewhere connected to a story. Emily scanned the room again. Thomas Whitaker remained exactly where he had been. Calm. Patient. Almost invisible despite standing in plain sight. Most people had already forgotten about him. They were busy greeting colleagues, discussing assignments, or taking photographs beneath the enormous American flag displayed behind the stage. The old veteran seemed content to let the evening continue without him. That alone made him unusual. Most people who felt slighted would have demanded attention. Thomas seemed to avoid it. Emily's eyes moved toward the occupied reserved seat. The sponsor who had taken it was now laughing with several guests at his table. Major Mark Ellison stood nearby speaking with event coordinators. Everything appeared normal. Yet the uncomfortable feeling remained. Then another memory surfaced. Not a story. A photograph. Years ago, Emily had visited her father's study. Colonel James Parker had served for more than 3 decades. Military history filled every shelf in the room. Framed photographs covered entire walls. One image in particular had fascinated her when she was younger. A faded black and white photograph showing several exhausted soldiers standing on a muddy hillside. Most of the names had been forgotten. One detail had not. Someone had written Hill 41 beneath the frame. Emily remembered asking about it. Her father had become unusually quiet. That hill produced heroes. Nobody talks about anymore, he had said. At the time, she had not understood what he meant. Now the memory returned with startling clarity. Her pulse quickened. She looked back toward Thomas. Could it be the same Hill 41? The coincidence felt impossible, yet she could not ignore it. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage to review final notes. Soft, instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers. Guests continued finding their seats. The evening was moving forward. Emily knew she should let it go. Instead, she found herself walking toward Thomas Whitaker. He noticed her approach and offered a polite nod. Up close, the signs of age were obvious. Fine lines marked his face. His silver hair was neatly combed. His suit was old, but carefully maintained. Nothing about him suggested importance. And somehow that made her even more curious. "Sir," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Of course." Emily hesitated. The coin. The engraving. Does Hill 41 mean something? For the first time all evening, something changed in the old veteran's eyes. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. He studied her for a moment before answering. "Your father served?" Emily blinked. "How did you know?" Thomas glanced toward the military banners hanging above the ballroom. Only children of soldiers ask questions like that. Emily could not help smiling. "My father was Colonel James Parker." The old veteran grew very still. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade around them. Then Thomas nodded slowly. James was a good man. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. Her father had retired years ago. Very few people outside military circles even knew his name anymore. Yet this man had spoken it instantly. Naturally, as though recalling an old friend. Before she could ask another question, Thomas's gaze drifted toward the stage entrance. Something had caught his attention. Emily followed his eyes. A senior aide in dress uniform had just entered the ballroom carrying a folder and scanning the room with growing concern. The senior aide moved quickly through the ballroom, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the carpet. Unlike the guests around him, he was not admiring the decorations or exchanging greetings. He was searching. His eyes swept across tables, aisles, and rows of seats with growing urgency. A folder remained tucked beneath one arm, opened just enough to reveal several printed pages. Captain Emily Parker noticed the tension immediately. So did Thomas Whitaker. The old veteran watched quietly as the aide checked the front row, frowned, then turned toward an event coordinator. Their brief conversation appeared calm on the surface, but Emily could see concern spreading across both faces. The coordinator pointed toward the reserved seat that was no longer empty. The aide's expression darkened. "Do you know him?" Emily asked softly. Thomas kept his eyes on the developing scene. "No," he replied. "But I know that look." The answer carried a trace of amusement. Emily glanced at him. "What look?" "Someone realizing something important has gone missing." Before she could respond, the aide crossed the room toward the front row. The sponsor sitting in the reserved seat noticed him approaching and straightened proudly, assuming he was about to be greeted. Instead, the aide stopped beside the chair and looked directly at the name card. His face tightened. He checked the folder, looked at the chair again, then checked the folder a second time. The sponsor's smile faded. Nearby guests began noticing the exchange. Conversations softened. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Major Mark Ellison immediately stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" The aide turned toward him. "Who authorized this seating change?" Ellison blinked. "A seating change. This seat." The aide pointed directly at the occupied chair. "Who authorized it?" The sponsor shifted uncomfortably. Ellison forced a professional smile. "There was some confusion earlier. We resolved it." The aide did not return the smile. "Resolved it?" His voice remained controlled, but something beneath the surface had hardened. Was the assigned guest relocated? Ellison suddenly felt less confident. An elderly attendee was moved to general seating. The aide stared at him. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he slowly closed the folder. "Where is he?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Emily watched the color drain from Ellison's face. The major glanced around the ballroom. His eyes eventually found Thomas standing near the column. The aide followed his gaze. The moment he saw the old veteran, everything changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. The man's posture straightened. His expression shifted from concern to disbelief, then to something very close to alarm. Without another word, he started walking across the ballroom. Guests instinctively moved aside. Chairs scraped softly against the carpet. Heads turned. A growing ripple of curiosity followed his path. Thomas remained exactly where he was. Calm, patient. The challenge coin rested inside his pocket. Emily could hear her own heartbeat now. The aide stopped a few feet from the veteran. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then the aide looked down at the folded invitation partially visible inside Thomas's jacket pocket. He looked back up. "Mr. Whitaker?" Thomas nodded. "Good evening." The aide exhaled slowly, as though releasing tension he had been carrying for hours. "Sir," he said carefully, "General Harlan has been asking whether you arrived." Around them, the ballroom seemed to freeze. Emily saw confusion spread across nearby faces. She saw Major Ellison standing motionless near the front row. She saw the sponsor slowly lower his drink. And for the first time all evening, people began looking at Thomas Whitaker not as an old man standing alone near a column, but as someone they had completely misunderstood. For a moment, nobody moved. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange silence, as if the evening itself had paused to listen. The senior aide stood before Thomas Whitaker with the posture of a man who had suddenly realized a serious mistake had been made. Around them, guests exchanged uncertain glances. A few people leaned forward in their seats. Others quietly lowered their phones. Even the event staff seemed unsure whether to continue preparing for the ceremony or stop and watch. Thomas offered a small smile. "I arrived about 20 minutes ago." The aide closed his eyes briefly. "Sir, General Harlan was informed that you had not checked in." Thomas glanced toward the front row. "That appears to be true." The response was so calm that several people nearby looked away in embarrassment. Captain Emily Parker could practically feel the discomfort spreading through the room. Major Mark Ellison stood frozen near the reserved seat. He wanted to step forward and explain the misunderstanding, but every explanation now sounded inadequate even inside his own head. The aide turned toward him. "Major, were you responsible for guest placement in this section?" The question was professional. The effect was not. Ellison swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Did you verify the assignment list?" "I believed I did." The aide stared at him for several seconds. "Believed?" The single word landed harder than a lecture. Before Ellison could answer, another voice came through the aide's earpiece. The man immediately raised a hand and listened. His expression changed. Then he reached for his phone and stepped several feet away. Emily watched him answer. Whatever he heard caused him to stand even straighter. "Yes, General," he said. The nearby tables fell completely silent. Several people heard the word. Every head turned. The aide listened carefully, then looked across the ballroom directly at Thomas Whitaker. "He is here, sir." More silence followed. The aide listened again. "No, sir. He is not seated." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even from across the ballroom, Emily could see the reaction in the aide's face. Whatever General Harlan was saying now required no interpretation. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, the aide lowered the phone very slowly. Major Ellison took one uncertain step forward. "Sir." The aide looked at him. "The general is delaying his entrance." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. That was almost unheard of. Military ceremonies ran on schedules measured down to the minute. Delays involving a 4-star general were rare. Delays caused by a single guest were practically unimaginable. The sponsor sitting in the reserved chair shifted uncomfortably. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. He glanced toward Thomas, then toward the stage, then down at the table in front of him. Nobody seemed interested in conversation anymore. The aide walked back toward Thomas. His tone softened. "Sir, General Harlan has asked me to personally escort you." Thomas looked toward the stage. "There is no need." The aide almost smiled. "Respectfully, sir, I do not believe that is a request I am authorized to ignore." A few people nearby exchanged bewildered looks. Emily noticed something else. Several retired officers seated near the center aisle had begun paying very close attention. One gray-haired colonel seemed to recognize the name. Another veteran frowned thoughtfully, as though reaching for a memory buried decades in the past. Thomas studied the ballroom for a moment. The chandeliers glowed overhead. The flag stood motionless behind the stage. Hundreds of guests watched him now, yet he appeared entirely unaffected by the attention. He nodded once. "All right." The aide stepped beside him. Together, they began walking toward the front of the room. Behind them, whispers spread from table to table. Ahead of them, the reserved seat remained occupied. And at that very moment, somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, General Robert Harlan had already changed course and was heading directly toward the hall. The walk to the front of the ballroom was only a few dozen yards, yet it felt far longer. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye followed Thomas Whitaker and the senior aide as they moved between rows of tables. The soft instrumental music still played through hidden speakers, but it now sounded distant beneath the growing tension. Guests who had ignored the old veteran less than an hour earlier were suddenly watching him, as if he carried an answer to a question nobody had known to ask. Major Mark Ellison remained near the front row. He tried to maintain his professional composure, but uncertainty had replaced confidence. The reserved seat stood only a few feet away. The sponsor occupying it no longer looked comfortable. He adjusted his tie, shifted in his chair, and glanced repeatedly toward the ballroom entrance. The aide slowed as he approached the front row. "Sir, your seat is ready." Thomas looked at the chair. Then he looked at the sponsor sitting in it. The younger man immediately stood halfway before hesitating. No one had actually asked him to move. Not yet. The room waited. Thomas simply shook his head. "It is fine." The answer surprised everyone. The sponsor looked relieved for a fraction of a second. Then the ballroom doors opened. The sound itself was small, barely noticeable, yet the effect was immediate. Conversations that had somehow resumed vanished again. Several uniformed officers instinctively straightened in their seats. Event staff stepped aside. General Robert Harlan entered without ceremony. There was no announcement, no introduction, no music cue. The 4-star general moved through the doorway with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades carrying responsibility. His silver hair reflected the chandelier light. His dress uniform was immaculate, yet his attention was focused on only one thing. He was not looking at the stage. He was not acknowledging sponsors, dignitaries, or senior officials. He was searching for one person. The moment his eyes found Thomas Whitaker, everything else disappeared. Captain Emily Parker saw it happen. She saw the general's expression soften, saw years of history pass silently between two men standing across a crowded ballroom. Harlan changed direction immediately. He walked straight down the center aisle. Guests moved aside without being asked. The room became so quiet that the faint click of his polished shoes echoed against the floor. Major Ellison stepped back. The sponsor stood completely now, unsure what to do. The general stopped directly in front of Thomas. For a second, neither man spoke. Then a faint smile appeared on Harlan's face. "You made it." Thomas smiled back. "I told you I would." Several people nearby exchanged stunned looks. The familiarity was unmistakable. This was not a casual acquaintance. This was something much deeper. General Harlan glanced toward the front row. His eyes settled on the occupied reserved seat. The smile disappeared. He looked at the sponsor, then at Major Ellison, then back at the chair. Silence spread through the ballroom like a wave. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sponsor slowly lowered his gaze. Major Ellison felt every eye in the room turn toward him. General Harlan took one deliberate step forward. His voice was calm, controlled, yet it carried effortlessly to every corner of the hall. "I had one seat reserved tonight." The words hung in the air. Heavy, precise, final. The general's gaze never left the chair. Around the ballroom, hundreds of people waited for what would come next. And in that silence, the truth was already beginning to emerge. No one dared interrupt the silence. General Robert Harlan stood facing the reserved seat while hundreds of guests watched. The sponsor who occupied it felt the weight of every eye in the room. Slowly, almost instinctively, he stepped away from the chair. The movement was small, but it changed everything. General Harlan nodded once. Then he looked directly at Thomas Whitaker. For a brief moment, the years seemed to disappear. The decorated officer and the quiet old veteran were no longer standing inside a ballroom filled with dignitaries and officials. They were simply two men connected by a history few people in the room understood. Then the general spoke. His voice was firm, calm, and impossible to ignore. "Stand." The single word echoed across the ballroom. Chairs shifted. Guests looked around in confusion. Some immediately rose to their feet. Others followed a second later. Within moments, the entire room stood. The general's gaze remained fixed on Thomas. He earned it. The silence that followed felt deeper than any applause. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Major Mark Ellison felt his face grow warm. The sponsor lowered his eyes. Across the ballroom, Captain Emily Parker watched as understanding finally began to spread from person to person. This was never about a seat. It was never about protocol. It was never about status. General Harlan stepped beside the chair and placed one hand on its back. 47 years ago, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the room. A young sergeant gave up his place on an evacuation aircraft because others needed it more. The ballroom remained motionless. Later that same night, when conditions became impossible and everyone was being told to leave, he went back for a lieutenant who had been left behind. Harlan paused. His eyes never left Thomas. "That lieutenant was me." Several people inhaled sharply. Others stared in disbelief. The general continued. "Everything that happened in my career afterward happened because one man refused to think about himself." Thomas lowered his gaze slightly. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable. Harlan smiled faintly, which is exactly why he never talks about it. A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd before fading again. The general reached toward Thomas's jacket. "Do you still carry it?" Thomas nodded and removed the worn challenge coin. Harlan accepted it carefully. The ballroom lights reflected off the scratched metal. He held it high enough for nearby guests to see. Most people would look at this and see an old coin. His thumb brushed across the faded engraving. "I see Hill 41. The room grew even quieter. "I see loyalty. I see sacrifice. I see a promise made by good men who never asked for recognition." Harlan returned the coin to Thomas's hand. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the four-star general personally pulled out the reserved chair. "Please sit down, Tom." Thomas hesitated. "You never make anything easy, do you?" The general laughed softly. "Not once." Gentle laughter spread through the ballroom, dissolving the last traces of tension. Thomas finally took the seat. Only after he was seated did General Harlan sit beside him. No one missed the symbolism. The highest-ranking person in the room had chosen his place only after ensuring the old veteran had his. Around the ballroom, people slowly returned to their seats. Yet something had changed. The room no longer saw an elderly man in an old suit. They saw a living piece of history. A man whose greatest act had not been seeking recognition, but avoiding it. Captain Emily Parker glanced toward Major Ellison. The young officer looked humbled. The sponsor appeared embarrassed. Neither needed a lecture. The lesson had already been delivered. General Harlan rose to begin the evening's ceremony. Before turning toward the stage, he rested a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. It was a simple gesture. Quiet, respectful, genuine. And somehow it carried more meaning than every speech that would follow. Because some honors are printed on certificates, some are engraved on medals, and some live only in the memories of those who were there. Respect is not demanded. It is earned and remembered.